All right, let's dive right in. You've sent us some pretty interesting stuff on Proxmox and Docker. Sounds like someone's looking to step up their Homelab game, huh?
Yeah, that's right. And this guide, Why Use Proxmox with Docker? A Beginner's Guide to Homelab Optimization. I think it's a perfect place to start.
It definitely is. We're going to break down the key points and see how it all connects to your Homelab goals. By the end of this deep dive, I think you'll totally get the hype around this whole Proxmox Docker thing, the real benefits, and most importantly, whether it's the right setup for you. So first things first, what are Proxmox and Docker all about?
Hmm. Let's start with Proxmox. So it's essentially an open source platform built on Debian Linux. It lets you create and manage these things called virtual machines, VMs for short, and containers using technologies like KVM and LXC. It's basically like having your own mini data center at home, all controlled through a super user-friendly web interface.
So you can have like multiple isolated operating systems running on just one piece of hardware?
Exactly. And then there's Docker. It's all about deploying applications inside containers, bundles, everything an app needs to run, libraries, dependencies, all that stuff, into this neat little package. And that ensures consistent performance across different environments.
Interesting. So Docker kind of takes the guesswork out of compatibility. Make sure your apps run smoothly regardless of what's underneath. I can see how that would be a huge plus for developers. But wouldn't running Docker inside a Proxmox VM just add like another layer of complexity? Why not just run Docker directly on the server?
That's a great question, and this is really where the magic of this combo starts to shine. One big advantage is the safety net you get with Proxmox. You can take these snapshots of your entire Docker setup before you change anything. Think of it like a rewind button for your home lab. You can experiment with different configs and updates, and you're not going to be scared of breaking things permanently.
That rewind button thing that really makes it click, I can see how that would be really reassuring, especially for someone who's new to home labs. But what about those times when you don't want to go back to a previous snapshot? Say you made a small change and it breaks something, but you don't want to lose all the other changes since the last snapshot.
Right, that's where this whole containerization thing comes in handy. Docker lets you isolate apps and their dependencies within containers. So even if one container goes haywire, it won't affect other containers, or even the underlying Proxmox host system.
So if I'm running like a web server in one Docker container and a database in another, and the web server crashes, the database container would just keep running like nothing happened.
Exactly. It's like compartments on a ship. Even if one compartment gets breached, the ship can still stay afloat. This prevents that dreaded kernel panic, a total system crash. That can happen when critical parts of the operating system get compromised.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't running Docker directly on the server without Proxmox in between, wouldn't they give you even better isolation since there's one less layer involved?
That's a good point, but remember, even though containers give you some isolation, they still share the same kernel as the host operating system. Running Docker within a Proxmox VM adds another layer of separation.
So even if a container were to be compromised, the damage is contained within that VM. And the Proxmox host system and any other VMs are safe and sound. That's a really impressive security advantage.
Yeah.
But are there other benefits to running Docker on Proxmox besides this enhanced security?
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Docker is super efficient at deploying and managing applications. Makes it super easy to spin up new services or test different configurations quickly. Proxmox, on the other hand, is amazing at managing virtual machines. So you can easily move those VMs between different hardware if your needs change.
So Docker's like this agile speedboat that gets you where you need to go quickly.
Yeah.
And Proxmox is like this powerful cargo ship that can transport those speedboats to different harbors.
That's a great way to put it. And the best part is Proxmox makes managing all this super easy with its user-friendly web interface. It's like a central command center for your home lab. You can monitor resources, manage backups, even control container states, all from a single dashboard.
So I wouldn't have to juggle multiple tools and interfaces. That sounds like a real time saver, especially for someone who's more comfortable with a visual interface than with the command line.
Exactly. And speaking of time savers, let's talk about snapshots again. Proxmox's snapshotting capabilities aren't just for Docker containers. You can take snapshots of entire VMs, which is incredibly useful for backing up and restoring your entire home lab setup, or even testing major system upgrades without any risk.
Okay, so if I wanted to test out a new version of Proxmox itself, I could take a snapshot of my current setup upgrade to the new version, and if things go wrong, I can just revert to the snapshot and be back up and running in no time. That's a pretty compelling feature. But I'm guessing there's more to it than just clicking a snapshot button, right?
Right, while snapshots are super powerful, there are some things to consider to use them effectively, like the size of your snapshots, especially if you're dealing with large virtual disks. Large snapshots can take up a lot of storage space. You also need to think about how often you're taking snapshots and how long you need to keep them.
That makes sense. So it's not just set it and forget it. There's some strategy involved in using snapshots effectively. But I'm assuming there are resources available to help with that, right?
Absolutely. The Proxmox documentation is a great place to start. And there's a really active community forum where you can get help with anything Proxmox, including best practices for snapshot management. And speaking of community, there's another interesting thing about Docker that we haven't talked about yet.
Okay.
Docker Hub. It's this massive online repository of pre-built Docker images. These images are basically blueprints for setting up all kinds of applications and services. You can find images for everything from web servers and databases to media streaming platforms and home automation tools.
So instead of having to configure everything from scratch, I could potentially pull a pre-built Docker image for, say, Plex Media Server and have it up and running in Proxmox in minutes. That's incredible. It's like having this huge library of ready-to-go applications.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those unique advantages of running Docker inside Proxmox. Not only does it provide a secure and isolated environment for these containerized applications, but it also gives you the flexibility to easily move your entire setup to different hardware if you need to.
So if I decide to upgrade my home server down the road, I can just migrate my Proxmox VM with all its Docker containers to the new hardware. And everything would just work seamlessly.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive. It makes the entire Homelab setup so much more portable and future-proof.
It does. That's one of the main reasons why this combination is so popular among Homelab enthusiasts. You get the best of both worlds, the power and flexibility of Docker for managing applications, and the robust virtualization and management features of Proxmox.
Okay, so we've talked about security snapshots, Docker Hub, even the portability of this setup. I'm sure there's a lot more to uncover. But before we go any further, what's been standing out to you the most about this combination so far?
For me, it's the level of control you have. We've talked about the big picture stuff, but being able to fine-tune things at such a granular level is what makes this setup really powerful. Like Proxmox lets you allocate resources to specific VMs and containers.
So I have a really resource-hungry application, like some crazy video editing program running in a Docker container. I could give that container more CPU cores and RAM to make sure it runs smoothly without impacting the performance of other VMs or containers on the same host.
Exactly. It's like having separate volume knobs for each instrument in a band. You can fine-tune the whole sound. And when you combine that control with the efficiency of containers, you can really unlock some serious potential.
That's a great analogy. It's almost like conducting an orchestra. Each instrument has its part, but you can adjust the volume and dynamics individually. But wouldn't this level of control make things even more complex?
To some extent, yes. But that's where Proxmox's interface really shines. It presents these complex settings in a way that's easy to understand, even if you're not a sysadmin guru. And if you ever get stuck, the Proxmox community is super helpful.
You know, that's something people often forget about open source software. That community aspect is huge. Having a network of users and developers who are willing to help with problems and share their knowledge. It's like having built-in tech support.
It really is. And speaking of support, another thing that impresses me is how long Proxmox and Docker have been around. They've both been around for a while now. Active development communities and a proven track record. It gives me confidence that this isn't just some fad. It's a solid base for a home lab that's built to last.
Stability and longevity are definitely important, especially when you're investing your time and effort into a home lab. You don't want to be constantly chasing the latest shiny thing or worrying about the platform you're using suddenly disappearing.
Exactly. You know, all this talk about benefits and features makes me think about the different ways you can use this combo. This guide you shared mentions a few interesting scenarios.
Yeah, let's dive into that. The guide talks about home server management development and testing and data safety and recovery as key areas where this combo really stands out.
Right. For managing your home server, imagine running things like Home Assistant for home automation, Plex for media streaming, or Nextcloud for cloud storage, all inside their own secure and isolated Docker containers managed by Proxmox. Easy updates, effortless backups, and the peace of mind knowing that these services are running smoothly and securely.
So it's like having a dedicated virtualized environment for each app, making sure they don't mess with each other or the host system. And with Docker Hub, you can pull pre-built images for these apps. Saves a ton of time setting everything up manually.
Exactly. And for developers or anyone who likes to play around with software, this combo is a dream come true. Docker's quick deployment and Proxmox's snapshots create a safe space for experimenting with new software testing configs or even developing code. without messing up your main system.
It's like a virtual sandbox where you can do whatever you want without consequences.
Right.
You can try new software versions, experiment with different settings, and if something breaks, just revert to a previous snapshot and you're good to go.
Precisely. And when it comes to data safety and recovery, Proxmox Backup Server, or PDS, adds another layer of redundancy. Make sure your data is protected even if a container or VM crashes. It's like a backup of your backup.
That's a level of data protection most home users probably don't even have on their main computers. It's like having an enterprise-grade backup solution in your home lab. But are there any situations where this combination might not be the best option? What about those downsides we talked about earlier, like resource overhead and complexity?
Yeah, those are valid concerns. It's important to be realistic about the potential drawbacks. Resource overhead can be an issue, especially if you're running really demanding apps on older or less powerful hardware.
So if I'm running multiple VMs with a ton of Docker containers, and each of those containers is running something that needs a lot of resources, I could run into performance issues if my server isn't up to the task.
That's right. It's crucial to choose the right hardware for your home lab needs. But in most cases, even a basic server can handle a good number of VMs and containers. And as for complexity, yes, there is a learning curve. Both Proxmox and Docker have their own quirks, and it takes time and effort to master them.
But wouldn't you say the benefits outweigh that added complexity, especially when you consider the long-term value and peace of mind it brings to a home lab?
Absolutely. It's an investment for sure, but for anyone who's serious about their home lab, it's worth it. And that learning curve doesn't have to be a solo climb. There are tons of resources online, from the official Proxmox and Docker documentation to community forums and YouTube tutorials.
That's a great point. Speaking of resources, are there any specific ones you'd recommend for someone starting out with Proxmox and Docker? Something that helped you or that you wish you knew about sooner?
Oh, for sure. One resource that really helped me grasp the basics of Proxmox was the Proxmox VE Administration Guide. It's a comprehensive document that covers everything, from installation and configuration to advanced networking and storage management.
Sounds like a great place to start to get a good understanding of Proxmox. What about Docker? Any go-to resources for that?
For Docker, I'd say check out the official Docker documentation, especially the Get Started section. It's a clear and concise intro to Docker concepts, and it walks you through building and running your first container.
So starting with those two resources would give someone a solid foundation for understanding the core concepts of both Proxmox and Docker.
Exactly. Once you have the basics down, you can explore more specific stuff, like the Proxmox Wiki, the Docker Hub, and the many forums and blogs dedicated to these platforms.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the technical details to the practical uses. But before we move on, I'm curious, what's your overall philosophy on home labs? What drives your passion for this?
That's a good question. I think it's all about empowerment. Having a home lab gives you the freedom to experiment, learn, and build things on your own terms. It's a space to explore new tech, test your limits, and push the boundaries of what's possible.
I love that. It's not just about the technology itself. It's about what you can do with it. It's about taking control of your own digital world and creating something unique and meaningful.
Exactly. And when you combine that feeling of empowerment with the power of Proxmox and the ease of use and portability of Docker, it opens up a whole new world.
You're absolutely right. This combo unlocks a level of control and flexibility that was once only available to big companies with dedicated IT departments.
And that's what's so exciting about the home lab movement. It's making powerful tech accessible to everyone, putting it in the hands of people who are passionate about learning, creating, and pushing boundaries.
It's a really inspiring movement to be a part of. And this guide you shared captures that essence perfectly. It's not just about the technical stuff. It's about the spirit of exploration and innovation that drives this community.
Couldn't agree more. All this talk about community and exploration makes me think about the collaborative side of home labs. It's not just about building things by yourself. It's about sharing your knowledge, experiences, and projects.
That's a great point. The home lab community is incredibly collaborative and supportive. People are constantly sharing their projects, tutorials, and tips online, helping each other learn, troubleshoot, and even build amazing things together.
Exactly. And platforms like GitHub and GitLab have made it so easy to collaborate on code and share projects. You can find open source home lab projects for everything, from home automation to self-hosted cloud services, all built and maintained by people who are passionate about sharing their knowledge and contributing to the community.
It's really amazing to see that level of collaboration and open sharing. It's a testament to the passion and generosity of the people involved. Have you ever collaborated on any Homelab projects yourself?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm actually working on a project right now with some other Homelab enthusiasts. We're building a self-hosted cloud platform using Proxmox and Docker. We're each contributing different parts, and it's been an amazing learning experience.
That sounds awesome. It really highlights the power of collaboration in the home lab space. You can use the combined knowledge and skills of the community to build really impressive things.
It's true. And that collaborative spirit goes beyond just building projects. It's also about helping each other troubleshoot problems, share best practices, and generally support each other on their home lab journeys.
That's an important point. The home lab community isn't about showing off your fancy setup or bragging about your tech skills. It's about helping each other learn, grow, and overcome challenges together. It's a community that truly embraces sharing and collaboration.
I couldn't agree more. That spirit of collaboration is something I find really valuable these days, when it feels like everyone is always competing. The home lab community is a refreshing reminder that there are still places where people genuinely want to help each other succeed.
I think that's beautiful, and it's something we can all learn from, whether we're into home labs or not. That spirit of collaboration, support, and shared learning, it's something we can all benefit from in our lives.
Absolutely. And this deep dive has been such an insightful journey. We've explored the technical side of Proxmox and Docker, talked about the practical uses, and even touched on the philosophy and community aspects of home labs. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has, and I think we've just scratched the surface. But before we wrap things up, are there any final thoughts or key takeaways you want to leave our listener with?
If I had to boil it down to one key takeaway, it'd be this: don't be intimidated. Proxmox and Docker might seem complicated at first, but with a little effort and a willingness to learn, they can unlock so much potential for your home lab.
That's good advice. And I
Yeah.
think it's important to remember that home labbing is all about learning, experimenting, and having fun. It's not about being perfect or having the most elaborate setup. It's about exploring your own curiosity and pushing your own boundaries.
Totally agree. And remember, you don't have to do it all alone. The home lab community is super welcoming and helpful. There are tons of resources online, and people are always willing to help.
That's a great point. So to our listener, we encourage you to jump in, explore, experiment, and most importantly, have fun on your home lab journey.
Well said.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Proxmox and Docker. Hope you found it informative, inspiring, and maybe even a little bit contagious.
It's been great sharing our passion for home labs with you.
Until next time, keep learning, keep building, and keep pushing the limits of what's possible.